Harry Potter could count on one hand the number of times anyone had acknowledged his birthday. This year would not be one of them. He lay in his cupboard under the stairs, listening to the familiar sounds of morning at number 4, Privet Drive. Aunt Petunia's sharp footsteps clicked across the kitchen floor above his head, punctuated by the occasional crash of breakfast dishes and Uncle Vernon's rumbling complaints about the state of his coffee. Dudley's thunderous descent down the stairs had already rattled the cupboard door twice, which meant it was nearly 8 o'clock. July 31st. 9 years old today, though the Dursleys would sooner acknowledge a plague of locusts than Harry's birthday. The thin mattress beneath him had long since compressed into something resembling cardboard, and the single blanket provided little warmth even in summer. Harry had grown accustomed to waking with a crick in his neck and the phantom ache of hunger in his stomach. At 9 years old, he was already smaller than other children his age, with a thinness that spoke of too many missed meals and hand-me-down clothes that hung loose on his narrow frame. He traced the lightning bolt scar on his forehead with one finger, a habit he'd developed when thinking. The Dursleys had told him it came from the car crash that killed his parents, lazy, unemployed drunks, according to Uncle Vernon. But sometimes Harry caught his aunt looking at the scar with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Boy," Uncle Vernon's bellow shook the house. "Get up here and start breakfast." Harry sighed and reached for his glasses, the frames held together with tape that Dudley had gleefully applied after snapping them during one of his games. The world came into focus slowly, revealing the cramped confines of his cupboard. A few books rescued from Dudley's discard pile, clothes that had once belonged to his cousin, and the collection of spiders he'd long since stopped trying to evict. As he pushed open the cupboard door, Harry paused. Something felt different about this morning, though he couldn't pinpoint what. The air seemed charged somehow, as if the very molecules were holding their breath. He climbed the narrow stairs to the kitchen, where Aunt Petunia stood at the stove with her back rigidly straight, her horse-like face already pinched with the day's first disapproval. Uncle Vernon sat at the table in his pajamas and robe, purple-faced and glowering at the morning paper, as if it had personally offended him. Dudley sprawled in his chair, still in his pajamas, his piggy eyes fixed on the plate of bacon his mother was preparing. "About time," Vernon muttered without looking up. "Bacon's getting cold." Harry moved to the stove, careful not to brush against his aunt. She flinched away from him anyway, as she always did, as if his mere presence might contaminate her pristine kitchen. He had learned early not to expect explanations for the Dursleys' behavior toward him. He was simply unwanted, a burden they bore with constant resentment. The morning routine unfolded with mechanical precision. Harry cooked breakfast while the Dursleys ignored him, served them at the table while they discussed Dudley's upcoming school activities, and began cleaning up while they made plans that pointedly excluded him. It was a dance of deliberate isolation that Harry had memorized by heart. He was elbow-deep in sudsy dishwater when the owl arrived. The tap against the kitchen window was sharp and insistent, nothing like the gentle morning bird song Harry might have expected. When he turned toward the sound, his breath caught in his throat. A large brown owl perched on the windowsill, its amber eyes fixed directly on him. In its beak was an envelope that seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light. "What the devil?" Uncle Vernon's chair scraped against the floor as he lurched to his feet. The owl tapped again, more firmly this time, and somehow Harry knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that it was waiting for him specifically. Aunt Petunia had gone rigid at the stove, her knuckles white as she gripped a spatula. "Vernon," she whispered, and there was something in her voice Harry had never heard before. Terror, perhaps, or recognition. "Get rid of it!" Vernon snarled, but he made no move toward the window himself. Harry found his feet carrying him forward before his mind had fully processed the decision. The owl watched his approach with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and when Harry reached for the window latch, it remained perfectly still. The envelope was addressed in emerald green ink, in handwriting that looked official and important. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard. Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive. Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry's hand trembled as he accepted the letter. The owl hooted once, a sound that somehow conveyed approval, and took flight, disappearing into the cloudy morning sky. "Give me that!" Vernon lunged forward, his face purpling to an alarming shade. But Harry had already broken the wax seal, which bore the image of a shield surrounded by 4 animals. The letter inside was written on heavy parchment that felt expensive beneath his fingers. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, London Vault Statement for account number 687, Potter Family Trust. As he read, the kitchen around him seemed to fade into insignificance. The letter detailed transactions spanning decades, withdrawal after withdrawal of enormous sums, more money than Harry could even comprehend. Thousands upon thousands of galleons, removed from an account that bore his family name. But the dates were wrong. The withdrawals began in 1949, nearly 30 years before Harry was even born. They continued through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and right up through the 1980s. The most recent withdrawal was dated just 6 months ago. 500 galleons for educational expenses. Harry's 9-year-old mind struggled to process what he was reading, but certain facts crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. This was his money, left to him by his parents. Someone had been taking it for 40 years, and the Dursleys, who fed him table scraps and locked him in a cupboard, had claimed they couldn't afford to care for him properly. "What does it say?" Dudley had crept closer, his pudgy face creased with curiosity. Harry looked up from the letter to find 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Aunt Petunia's face had drained of all color, while Uncle Vernon looked as if he might explode. "It says," Harry began slowly, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "that someone's been stealing from me." The silence that followed was deafening. Vernon's hand shot out to snatch the letter, but Harry clutched it to his chest with surprising determination. For the first time in his life, he had proof of something, though what exactly he wasn't sure. "Give me that rubbish this instant," Vernon roared. "It's not rubbish," Harry said quietly. "It's from a bank, about my inheritance." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Inheritance implied parents who had left him something of value, parents who had cared enough to provide for his future. It contradicted every story the Dursleys had ever told him about worthless, unemployed drunks who died in a car crash. Aunt Petunia sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "They said this wouldn't happen," she whispered. "They promised he wouldn't know until—" "Shut up, Petunia!" Vernon's bellow shook the windows, but it was too late. Harry had heard enough to know that the Dursleys had been lying to him about more than he'd ever imagined. The letter in his hands was proof of a world beyond Privet Drive, a world where his family name meant something, where he was more than an unwanted burden. He backed toward the hallway, clutching the letter like a lifeline. Vernon made another grab for it, but Harry was quicker, ducking under his uncle's meaty arm and bolting for his cupboard. "Boy!" Vernon thundered behind him. "You come back here this instant!" Harry slammed the cupboard door and fumbled for the makeshift lock he'd installed after too many midnight raids from Dudley. His heart hammered against his ribs as he read the letter again by the dim light filtering through the door's ventilation slats. 40 years of withdrawals, thousands of galleons, educational expenses that had certainly never been spent on his education. For the first time in his 9 years of life, Harry Potter began to understand that his story was not the one he'd been told. The letter crackled between Harry's trembling fingers as he read it for the 4th time. Even in the dim light filtering through the cupboard's ventilation slats, the emerald ink seemed to shimmer with an authority that made his small space feel smaller still. Each line revealed impossibilities that his 9-year-old mind struggled to process. Vault 687. Potter Family Trust. Galleons, whatever those were, disappearing in amounts that meant nothing to him, yet somehow felt enormous. 500 here, 1,000 there, withdrawals stretching back decades before his birth. The most unsettling detail was how precise everything appeared. Dates, amounts, authorization codes, all recorded with the meticulous care of an institution that took such matters seriously. This wasn't some child's fantasy or elaborate prank. The parchment felt expensive beneath his fingertips, heavier than any paper he'd ever touched. Educational expenses, he whispered, reading one entry aloud. The irony wasn't lost on him, even at 9. The Dursleys had spent years complaining about the cost of his upkeep, grudgingly buying him Dudley's cast-offs and the cheapest school supplies available. Yet here was evidence of money, his money, being spent on education for decades. Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs above his head, accompanied by Uncle Vernon's increasingly purple-faced shouts about freakish nonsense and getting to the bottom of this. Harry pressed himself further into the corner of his cupboard, clutching the letter against his chest. The cupboard door rattled violently. "Open this door right now, boy." "I can't," Harry called back, which was technically true. The makeshift lock he'd installed could only be opened from inside, a small rebellion that had cost him several meals when the Dursleys discovered it. "Don't you dare lie to me." The door shook harder. "That letter is dangerous rubbish, and you're going to hand it over this instant." But even as Vernon's threats grew louder, Harry found his grip on the letter tightening. For the first time in his life, he possessed something that belonged unequivocally to him. Something that proved he was more than the unwanted burden the Dursleys claimed him to be. The assault on his door ceased abruptly, replaced by hushed, urgent voices. Harry pressed his ear to the thin wood, straining to catch fragments of conversation. "Told us this wouldn't happen." Aunt Petunia's voice, higher and more strained than usual. "Should have burned it the moment it arrived," Uncle Vernon, pacing by the sound of his heavy footfalls. "What if they send more? Can't let him read about—" The voices moved away, toward the kitchen, leaving Harry alone with questions that multiplied faster than he could examine them. Who were they? What wouldn't happen? What else might he read about? He studied the letterhead again, trying to memorize every detail. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The word wizarding seemed particularly significant, though he couldn't quite grasp why. The shield with 4 animals, a lion, a snake, a badger, and an eagle, looked like something from a fairy tale. Yet the official tone of the letter suggested anything but fantasy. His thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tap on the cupboard door. Not Vernon's violent pounding, but something almost tentative. "Harry." Dudley's voice, unusually quiet. This was unexpected. Dudley rarely acknowledged Harry's existence unless it involved some form of torment. They weren't friends, could never be friends, given the Dursleys' careful cultivation of Dudley's disdain for his cousin. But occasionally, very rarely, Dudley displayed something approaching curiosity about Harry's circumstances. "What do you want, Dudley?" "Mum and Dad are in the kitchen talking," Dudley whispered. "They're scared. Really scared." What did that letter say? Harry hesitated. Dudley had participated in enough of his misery over the years to warrant suspicion. but there was something different in his cousin's tone. Not malicious for once, almost concerned. "It says someone's been taking money from me," Harry said finally. "Money my parents left me." A long pause. "How much money?" Harry looked down at the figures again, though the amounts remained meaningless to him. "Thousands. Maybe more. I don't really understand it." Another pause, longer this time. When Dudley spoke again, his voice carried a note Harry had never heard before, something that might have been guilt. "They always said your parents didn't leave you anything, that they were poor and drunk and worthless. I know what they said." The floorboards creaked as Dudley shifted his weight. "But if you have money, real money, why do they make you wear my old clothes? Why do you live in there?" It was a fair question, and one that Harry had been asking himself since the owl's arrival. Why indeed? If he truly had an inheritance, if there truly was money with his name on it, then everything the Dursleys had told him about being a burden was a lie. "I don't know," Harry admitted. The kitchen voices grew louder, more agitated. Harry caught fragments again, something about Dumbledore and promises, and what we agreed. The name meant nothing to him, but it seemed to carry weight with his aunt and uncle. "They're coming back," Dudley whispered urgently, and Harry heard him scramble away from the door. Sure enough, Vernon's heavy tread approached again, accompanied by the sharp click of Aunt Petunia's heels. "Boy!" Vernon's voice had taken on a different quality. Less rage, more desperation. "We need to talk. Come out of there." "We know you're confused," Aunt Petunia added, her tone artificially gentle in a way that immediately put Harry on guard. "That letter is just someone playing a nasty trick. There's no inheritance. Your parents didn't leave you anything." But Harry was no longer the helpless child who accepted their explanations without question. The letter in his hands was real, official, detailed. It spoke of years of activity in an account bearing his family name. Either it was an impossibly elaborate hoax, or the Dursleys had been lying to him his entire life. "If there's no inheritance," Harry called through the door, "then why are you so worried about the letter?" Silence fell in the hallway, a telling silence that confirmed Harry's growing suspicions. "Because," Vernon said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "that kind of freakish nonsense is exactly what we've been trying to protect you from. It's dangerous. It'll fill your head with impossible ideas and make you think you're something special when you're not." But Harry was beginning to think that perhaps he was something more than the Dursleys wanted him to believe. The letter suggested a world beyond Privet Drive, a world where his family name carried significance, where people kept careful records of his finances and sent owls to deliver important correspondence. "I want to understand what it means," Harry said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "It doesn't mean anything," Vernon roared, his careful control finally snapping. "It's lies and tricks and freakish nonsense that normal people don't need to worry about." But even as Vernon raged, Harry found his resolve hardening. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the safest hiding place he could think of, inside his pillowcase, next to the few possessions that truly belonged to him. Whatever the letter meant, whatever world it represented, Harry intended to find out. For 9 years he had accepted the Dursleys' version of his story: unwanted orphan, burden, charity case. But the letter suggested a different story entirely, one where he had value, where he had rights, where he had a legacy beyond the cupboard under the stairs. The voices in the hallway continued, planning and plotting, and trying to contain something that was already beyond their control. But Harry was no longer listening. He was thinking about owls and emerald ink, and the possibility that everything he'd been told about himself was wrong. For the first time in his young life, Harry Potter was beginning to question not just the Dursleys' treatment of him, but the very foundation of the reality they had constructed around him. And that questioning, that first spark of rebellion against accepted truth, would prove far more dangerous to their carefully maintained lies than any letter from a wizarding bank. The second owl arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, as if punctuality were encoded in its very nature. Harry had spent a sleepless night in his cupboard, alternating between studying the vault statement by the light of a pen torch and listening to the urgent, whispered conversations that continued well past midnight in the kitchen above. The Dursleys had spoken in fragments and half-sentences, as if afraid that saying certain words aloud might somehow summon the very forces they were trying to avoid. When the familiar tapping came at the kitchen window, Harry felt his stomach drop with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Not again," Uncle Vernon's voice cracked across the sudden silence that had fallen over the breakfast table. This owl was different from yesterday's messenger. Smaller, sleeker, with feathers so dark they seemed to absorb the morning light. It carried an envelope of the same heavy parchment, but this time the emerald ink seemed more urgent somehow, as if the very letters were impatient to be read. "Don't you dare go near that window," Aunt Petunia hissed, but her voice shook with barely controlled hysteria. Harry remained frozen at the sink, a plate suspended in sudsy water, as the owl continued its insistent tapping. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a countdown, each tap marking the seconds until something irreversible would happen. "It won't go away," Dudley whispered from his position at the table, where he sat staring at the owl with wide, frightened eyes. "They don't just go away, do they?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because none of them truly understood what they were dealing with. Yesterday's letter had opened a door to a world that operated by different rules, and now that world was insisting on their attention. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia's voice was barely audible. "What if they send someone? What if they come here?" Uncle Vernon's face had progressed beyond purple into a shade that bordered on burgundy. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the morning coolness, and his hands trembled as he gripped his coffee mug. "They can't," he said, but the conviction that usually characterized his pronouncements was notably absent. "We have rights. This is our home." But even as he spoke, Harry could see the uncertainty in his uncle's eyes. Whatever authority Vernon believed he possessed in the normal world seemed suddenly fragile when confronted with owls that knew exactly where to find him, and letters that detailed financial records spanning decades. The owl tapped again, more sharply this time, and Harry found his feet moving toward the window before his mind had consciously decided to act. "Boy, stop right there!" Vernon lurched to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor, but Harry was already reaching for the window latch. The owl regarded him with the same unsettling intelligence as its predecessor, and when he opened the window, it hopped inside with an authority that suggested it had every right to enter their kitchen. The envelope was addressed in the same formal script, but this time the return address made Harry's breath catch in his throat. "Gringotts Wizarding Bank Official, Goblin Representative Urgent, Account Holder Response Required." "Give me that immediately." Vernon made a grab for the letter, but Harry had learned from yesterday's attempt. He ducked under his uncle's reaching arm and broke the wax seal before anyone could stop him. The letter was shorter than the vault statement, but its message was far more alarming. "Mr. H. Potter, due to irregularities discovered in your family trust account, a Gringotts representative will be calling upon you this afternoon at 3 o'clock to discuss the matter in person. This is not a request. Please ensure you are available to receive our representative, who operates under full authority of Goblin banking law. Yours in gold, Ragnok Senior Account Manager, Vault Management Division. Harry read the letter twice before the full impact hit him. Someone was coming here. To Privet Drive. This afternoon. "What does it say?" Aunt Petunia demanded, her voice pitched higher than Harry had ever heard it. "Someone's coming here," Harry said slowly, "at 3 o'clock, to talk about the account." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Dudley, who rarely grasped the full implications of adult crises, seemed to understand that this was catastrophic news. Vernon sank back into his chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. "They can't come here," he whispered. "This is a respectable neighborhood. What will the neighbors think?" It was such a perfectly Vernon response, worrying about neighborhood opinions in the face of something far beyond his comprehension, that Harry might have laughed under different circumstances. But the fear emanating from his relatives was too thick, too genuine for amusement. "We have to leave," Aunt Petunia said suddenly. "Right now, before they get here." "Leave?" Vernon stared at his wife, as if she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly away. "We can go to your sister's place in Scotland. Take Dudley out of school for a few days. Say there was a family emergency." Petunia was already moving toward the hallway, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. "By the time we get back, this whole mess will have sorted itself out." But Harry found himself speaking before he could consider the wisdom of it. "What if they follow you?" The question stopped Petunia mid-stride. She turned to face him with an expression that mixed terror with something that might have been respect. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Harry looked down at the letter again, noting details that had escaped his first reading. The address was precise, not just the house number and street, but his specific sleeping arrangement. These people, whoever they were, knew exactly where he lived and how he lived. "They knew to send the first letter to the cupboard under the stairs," Harry said. "They know more about this house than they should. What makes you think they won't know where you go?" Vernon was now breathing in short, sharp bursts that suggested he was on the verge of panic. "This is madness, complete madness. These people can't just barge into our lives and make demands." "But they already have," Harry pointed out with the brutal logic of childhood. "And they're not asking permission." The owl, which had remained perched on the back of a kitchen chair throughout this exchange, suddenly spread its wings and took flight. It circled the kitchen once before disappearing through the open window, leaving behind only the lingering sense that it had delivered its message and fulfilled its duty. 4 hours, Dudley said into the silence, his mathematical skills finally proving useful. "That's not enough time to get to Scotland." Aunt Petunia sank into a chair, her face pale and drawn. For the first time in Harry's memory, she looked genuinely defeated. "They know where you are," she said to Harry, and there was something in her voice that suggested this had always been her greatest fear. "They've always known where you are." Harry wanted to ask who they were, why their knowledge of his location was so terrifying, and what the Dursleys had been hiding from him all these years. But before he could form the questions, Vernon spoke again. "We can't run," he said heavily. "Not from this, whatever this is." The admission seemed to cost him something vital. Vernon Dursley was a man who believed in the absolute authority of normal life, the supremacy of suburban routine, and the protective power of respectability. To acknowledge that there were forces beyond his control, beyond his understanding, was tantamount to admitting that his entire worldview was inadequate. "So what do we do?" Petunia asked. Vernon looked at Harry with an expression the boy had never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite resignation, but something that acknowledged Harry as a person rather than a burden. "We wait," Vernon said finally. and we hope that whoever comes is reasonable." But Harry, studying the formal language of the letter and remembering the owl's unwavering determination, suspected that reasonable might not be the appropriate word for what was coming to Privet Drive at 3 o'clock. The morning stretched ahead of them, each minute bringing them closer to an encounter none of them understood, but all of them feared. Outside, the suburban neighborhood continued its peaceful existence, unaware that the careful boundaries between the ordinary and extraordinary were about to be permanently altered. Harry folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket alongside the vault statement. Whatever happened at 3 o'clock, whatever these representatives wanted to discuss, he intended to be ready for it. The Dursleys might be terrified of this intrusion into their normal world, but Harry was beginning to realize that normal had never truly applied to him anyway. For 9 years, he had been living a lie constructed by people who feared the truth. Now the truth was coming to find him, whether the Dursleys approved or not. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell of number 4 Privet Drive rang with a sound that seemed to carry more authority than any doorbell had a right to possess. The Dursleys had spent the intervening hours in a state of barely controlled hysteria. Vernon had called in sick to work, something Harry had never known him to do, while Petunia had obsessively cleaned the already spotless house as if preparing for an inspection by royalty. Dudley had been banished to his room with strict instructions to remain silent no matter what he heard. Harry sat on the bottom stair, positioned where he could see the front door, but still retreat to his cupboard if necessary. The vault statement and the goblin's letter were folded carefully in his pocket, tangible proof that this was not some elaborate nightmare. The doorbell rang again, with the same measured insistence as the owl's tapping. "Answer it, Vernon," Aunt Petunia whispered from the kitchen doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Why me?" Vernon's voice cracked slightly. "You're the one who—" He stopped himself, but not before Harry caught the implication that his aunt knew more about this situation than she had ever admitted. The third ring carried an unmistakably impatient tone, as if the visitor was perfectly aware that the occupants of the house were hiding just inside. Vernon straightened his tie, smoothed his mustache, and approached the front door with the air of a man walking to his execution. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. The figure on the doorstep was unlike anything Harry had ever seen, though something deep in his mind whispered that this was exactly what he should have expected. The goblin, for goblin he clearly was, despite Harry's lack of any frame of reference for such creatures, stood barely 4 feet tall, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Vernon's appearance in a single glance. His skin was swarthy, his fingers long and elegant despite their obvious strength, and his ears came to distinct points beneath carefully groomed dark hair. He wore robes of deep blue that managed to look both formal and practical, and he carried a leather briefcase that suggested serious business. "Mr. Vernon Dursley," the goblin said, and his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. It was not a question. "Yes," Vernon managed, his usual bluster reduced to a whisper. "I am Griphook, representing Gringotts Wizarding Bank in the matter of vault irregularities concerning Mr. Harry Potter. I believe you are expecting me." Harry felt something shift inside him at the formal acknowledgement of his name, his identity as someone worthy of official attention. For 9 years he had been boy or freak, or, at best, a reluctant Harry spoken with obvious distaste. To hear himself referred to as Mr. Potter by this serious, businesslike creature was startling. "There's been some mistake," Vernon began, but Griphook cut him off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and absolutely final. "There has indeed been a mistake, Mr. Dursley, a very serious one. May I come in?" It was phrased as a question, but Harry could see that Griphook was already stepping forward, and Vernon found himself backing away automatically. There was something about the goblin's presence that made resistance seem not just futile, but absurd. Griphook entered the hallway and immediately fixed his dark eyes on Harry. "Mr. Potter, I presume?" "Yes," Harry said, his voice stronger than he had expected it to be. "Excellent." Griphook's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something that suggested approval. "I trust you received our correspondence?" "Both letters," Harry confirmed, patting his pocket. "Splendid. Then you are aware that there are significant irregularities in your family trust account that require immediate attention." Aunt Petunia emerged from the kitchen, wringing her hands. "Look, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Harry doesn't have any accounts. His parents didn't leave him anything. They were drunk and worthless. Yes, I'm familiar with that particular fiction." Griphook's tone remained perfectly professional, but there was an edge to it that made Petunia flinch. Mrs. Petunia Dursley, née Evans, I believe, sister to the late Lily Potter. The formal acknowledgement of her connection to Harry's mother seemed to hit Petunia like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her face ashen. "How did you—" she began, but Griphook was already moving toward the sitting room. "Might we continue this conversation in more comfortable surroundings? I have a considerable amount of information to share." The Dursleys had little choice but to follow Griphook into their pristine sitting room, where he settled himself in Vernon's favourite chair, with the air of someone conducting business in his own office. Harry perched on the edge of the sofa, while the Dursleys hovered uncertainly, as if sitting down might somehow make this situation more real. Griphook opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder bound with what appeared to be golden cord. The Potter Family Trust, Vault number 687, was established in 1903 by Henry Potter and has been maintained continuously since that time. Upon the deaths of James and Lily Potter in 1981, full ownership passed to their son, Harry James Potter. "But he's only 9, Vernon protested weakly. "Indeed, which is why the account included provisions for a magical guardian to oversee withdrawals until Mr. Potter reaches his majority." Griphook's eyes glittered with something that might have been anger. "Unfortunately, those provisions have been, shall we say, creatively interpreted." Harry leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Griphook opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. Even upside down, Harry could see they were covered with columns of numbers, dates, and what looked like signatures. Beginning in 1949, regular withdrawals were made from your account under the authorization of one Albus Dumbledore, who claimed guardianship privileges as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. Initially, these withdrawals were modest, funds for your care, education, and welfare, while you resided with your Muggle relatives. Harry's heart began to pound. The name Dumbledore had appeared in the Dursleys' whispered conversations, spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. However, Griphook continued, the amounts and frequency of these withdrawals have increased dramatically over the decades. Furthermore, our recent audit suggests that the stated purposes for these withdrawals, your care and education, do not align with your actual living conditions. The goblin's dark eyes fixed on Harry's too large clothes, his taped glasses, his thin frame. Then he looked around the sitting room, taking in the expensive furniture, the large television, the general atmosphere of comfortable prosperity. "It appears," Griphook said with delicate precision, "that funds designated for your welfare have been redirected." The silence in the room was absolute. Harry stared at the documents, trying to process what he was hearing. Someone named Dumbledore had been taking money from his account for decades, supposedly for Harry's care, but that money had clearly never reached him. "How much?" Harry asked quietly. Griphook consulted one of the documents. "Approximately 47,000 galleons over the past 40 years. In current exchange rates, that represents roughly £200,000. Vernon made a choking sound. Petunia had gone so pale that Harry thought she might faint. £200,000, Harry repeated slowly. The number was so large it felt meaningless, but he could see its impact on his relatives. That was more money than Vernon earned in years of work, enough to buy houses, to change lives completely. All withdrawn under the authority of Albus Dumbledore, Griphook confirmed. All supposedly for your benefit. Harry looked around the sitting room again, seeing it with new eyes. The expensive television, the quality furniture, Dudley's countless toys and games. How much of it had been purchased with money that was supposed to care for Harry? "The Dursleys knew?" Harry asked. "The Dursleys," Griphook said, consulting another document, "have received monthly payments of £50 since 1981 for your care and maintenance. These payments were presented as coming from a government assistance program for orphaned children." Harry turned to stare at his aunt and uncle. £50 a month for 9 years. That was more than £5,000, yet he had never seen a penny of it spent on his needs. "Government assistance," he said flatly. Vernon's face had progressed beyond purple, into a shade that suggested imminent cardiac arrest. We were told, it was compensation for taking you in. For the inconvenience." "Inconvenience," Harry repeated. And for the first time in his life, he felt something that might have been real anger beginning to build inside him. "Mr. Potter," Griphook said gently, "I believe it is time you understood exactly who you are and what has been done to you. Your parents did not die as drunkards in a car crash. They were murdered by a dark wizard while protecting you. They left you a considerable inheritance precisely because they wanted to ensure your welfare. And that inheritance has been systematically plundered by those claiming to act in your best interests." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Harry felt the foundation of his entire world shifting beneath him, everything he had been told about himself and his past, crumbling into lies. "What happens now?" he asked. Griphook's expression grew sharp, businesslike. "Now, Mr. Potter, we discuss restitution, and we ensure that such irregularities never occur again." The journey to Gringotts was Harry's first experience with magical transportation, though Griphook had called it by the rather mundane name of flue travel. One moment, Harry had been standing in the Dursleys' fireplace, clutching a handful of sparkling green powder, and the next he was stumbling out of a marble fireplace in the most magnificent building he had ever seen. The main hall of Gringotts Wizarding Bank rose around him in gleaming white marble and brass, with dozens of goblins working behind tall counters that stretched along both walls. The ceiling soared so high that Harry had to crane his neck to see the crystal chandeliers that cast warm light over the bustling activity below. The sound of quills scratching on parchment, coins clinking, and measured goblin voices created a symphony of serious business. "Impressive, isn't it?" Griphook observed, noting Harry's wide-eyed stare. "Gringotts has been the foundation of wizarding finance for over 5 centuries. We take our responsibilities seriously." The emphasis on responsibilities carried a clear implication about others who had perhaps been less conscientious in their duties. Griphook led Harry through a maze of corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced goblins and past offices where the soft murmur of financial discussions could be heard through heavy wooden doors. Finally, they arrived at a room marked with a brass plate reading Vault Management Division, Senior Accounts. The office beyond was smaller than Harry had expected, but every surface was covered with meticulously organized documents, ledgers, and what appeared to be magical recording devices that hummed softly as they worked. Behind the desk sat another goblin, this one older than Griphook, with silver threading through his dark hair and spectacles perched on his pointed nose. "Mr. Potter," the older goblin rose and inclined his head formally. "I am Ragnok, Senior Account Manager." "Thank you for coming." Harry found himself straightening under the goblin's serious regard. "Thank you for helping me understand what happened." Ragnok's expression softened slightly at Harry's polite response. "Indeed. Now, let us examine the full scope of the irregularities in your account." The documents Ragnok spread across the desk were far more comprehensive than anything Griphook had shown at Privet Drive. These were official Gringotts records, each page stamped with the bank's seal and marked with dates, amounts, and authorization signatures that stretched back decades. The Potter Family Trust was established with specific provisions for the care of minor heirs, Ragnok began, pointing to a section of faded text. "Your great-grandfather was quite particular about ensuring the family wealth would be properly managed in the event of untimely deaths." Harry leaned forward, studying the cramped handwriting that detailed his family's attempts to protect him from exactly the situation he now found himself in. "However," Ragnok continued, "those protections assumed that any magical guardian appointed would act in the heir's best interests. They did not account for someone who would interpret best interests quite so creatively." He turned to a section of records that began in 1949, 40 years before Harry's birth. The entries were signed with a flowing script that read, "A. Dumbledore," in confident strokes. "Albus Dumbledore first gained access to your family trust through a letter of temporary guardianship issued by the Wizengamot following your parents' deaths," Ragnok explained. "Such letters are not uncommon in cases where magical orphans require care and protection." "But this started before I was born," Harry pointed out, studying the dates. "Indeed, that is where the irregularities become significant." Ragnok's tone carried the particular disapproval that accountants reserved for creative bookkeeping. "It appears that Professor Dumbledore obtained a separate authorization in 1949, claiming anticipatory guardianship over the eventual Potter heir due to ongoing threats from dark wizards." Harry's 9-year-old mind struggled with the concept, but the implications were clear enough. He was taking money from my family before I even existed, for your eventual protection and care, according to his letters of authorization. Griphook handed Harry a file thick with correspondence. Professor Dumbledore was quite thorough in his documentation. The letters made fascinating reading, even for a 9-year-old. Dumbledore wrote with elegant formality about the need to establish safe houses, fund protective magic, and ensure that the future Potter heir would be properly cared for, regardless of circumstances. His justifications were detailed, his logic seemed sound, and his concern appeared genuine. "It all sounds very responsible," Harry said slowly. "Yes," Ragnok agreed. "The early withdrawals were indeed modest and appeared entirely legitimate. Funding for protective charms, payments to safe house keepers, research into defensive magic, all things that would benefit a Potter heir under threat." He turned to a different section of records, these from the 1960s and 1970s. However, the pattern changes significantly as the years progress. Harry could see the difference, even without accounting expertise. The amounts grew larger, the descriptions more vague. Instead of specific protective measures, the justifications became general. Ongoing protection costs, educational preparation, guardian expenses. "And after your parents' deaths," Ragnok continued, moving to the most recent records, the withdrawals increased dramatically while their stated purposes became even less specific. The numbers from the 1980s were staggering. Thousands of galleons withdrawn annually for orphan care expenses and educational requirements and ongoing protection. Yet Harry had lived in a cupboard, worn second-hand clothes, and attended state school like any other child in Little Whinging. "Where did it all go?" Harry asked. "That, Mr. Potter, is what we intend to find out." Ragnok closed the files with a decisive snap. "Which brings us to the matter of proper oversight." He reached for a piece of official-looking parchment and began drafting a letter in his careful script. "The Ministry of Magic has certain responsibilities regarding magical orphans and their inheritances. Minister Bagnold should have been informed of these irregular patterns years ago." Harry watched the goblin write, noting the formal language and official seals that marked this as serious correspondence between institutions. "Will she listen?" "Minister Millicent Bagnold has a reputation for efficiency and accountability," Ragnok replied. "She will certainly be interested to learn that such significant irregularities have occurred under her administration, particularly given the current political climate." Griphook leaned forward. "The minister faces re-election next year. The revelation that a prominent wizard has been systematically plundering an orphan's inheritance for 40 years would be politically inconvenient." Harry began to understand that his situation was about more than just missing money. This was the kind of scandal that could damage careers and reputations, the kind of institutional failure that demanded official response. "What happens next?" he asked. Ragnok sealed the letter to the minister and handed it to a small owl that had been waiting patiently on a perch by the window. "Next, we establish a complete audit trail. Every withdrawal, every authorization, every signature must be verified against actual expenditures." He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began making notes. "We will require Professor Dumbledore to provide detailed accounting for every galleon withdrawn from your trust. We will examine the legal basis for his guardianship claims, and we will ensure that proper oversight is established going forward." "And if he can't account for the money?" Harry asked. The silence that followed was telling. Griphook and Ragnok exchanged a look that suggested they had considerable experience with such situations. "Then, Mr. Potter," Ragnok said carefully, "we will pursue restitution through every legal avenue available to us. Gringotts takes a very dim view of those who abuse our trust." Harry studied the neat piles of evidence surrounding him. 40 years of systematic withdrawals, authorization letters that seemed to grant unlimited access to his family's wealth, and a pattern of increasing amounts with decreasing justification. The scope of it was overwhelming, but the goblin's methodical approach made it seem manageable somehow. For the first time since the owl had arrived at Privet Drive, Harry began to feel that he might actually get answers to his questions, and more than answers, he might get justice. "When do we start?" he asked. Ragnok's stern features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. "Mr. Potter, we already have." The man who appeared in Ragnok's office 2 hours later was nothing like what Harry had expected from the whispered conversations and fearful references he had overheard from the Dursleys. Albus Dumbledore was tall and thin, with silver hair and beard so long they reached nearly to his waist. Half-moon spectacles perched on his long, crooked nose, and his blue eyes held a twinkle that seemed both kindly and calculating. He wore robes of deep purple, adorned with silver stars, and despite his advanced age, he moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to command. "Ah," Dumbledore said, as he settled into the chair Ragnok indicated, his gaze finding Harry immediately. "Mr. Potter, how wonderful to finally meet you properly." The casual warmth in his voice made Harry feel simultaneously welcomed and manipulated. This was the man who had been taking money from his family for 40 years, yet he spoke as if they were old friends meeting for tea. "Professor Dumbledore," Ragnok began without preamble, "thank you for responding to our summons so promptly. As you are aware, we are conducting an audit of the Potter Family Trust, and there are significant irregularities that require explanation." Dumbledore's expression remained pleasant, but Harry caught a flicker of something, caution, perhaps, or calculation, behind the kindly facade. "Indeed," Dumbledore said mildly, "though I confess I am somewhat puzzled by the characterization of irregularities. All my withdrawals from young Harry's trust have been properly authorized and carefully documented." Griphook placed the thick file of records on the desk between them. 47,000 galleons over 40 years, Professor, beginning 29 years before Mr. Potter was even born. "Precautionary measures," Dumbledore replied smoothly. Given the threats facing the Potter family, it seemed prudent to establish protective measures well in advance. Harry leaned forward, his green eyes fixed on the man who had shaped his life from the shadows. "What threats?" Dumbledore's gaze shifted to Harry, and for a moment his expression softened with what might have been genuine affection. "My dear boy, the wizarding world can be a dangerous place for those with your particular significance. Your parents faced threats from dark wizards who would have harmed you simply for who you were destined to become." "Destined to become what?" Harry pressed, but Dumbledore had already turned back to Ragnok, deflecting the question with practiced ease. "I trust you understand the delicate nature of these matters. The protections I put in place have kept young Harry safe for 9 years. "Safe," Harry repeated, and there was an edge to his voice that made Dumbledore's eyebrows rise slightly. "Living in a cupboard is safe?" The silence that followed was profound. Dumbledore's blue eyes sharpened behind his spectacles, studying Harry with new attention. "A cupboard?" Dumbledore's voice carried a note of surprise that seemed genuine. "The cupboard under the stairs at Privet Drive," Harry said clearly, "where I've slept for 9 years while you spent thousands of pounds of my money on my care." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. When he spoke, his tone had lost some of its casual warmth. "The Dursleys were specifically instructed in their responsibilities toward you, Harry. If they have failed in their duties, that is disappointing." "They were paid £50 a month to care for him," Ragnok interjected, consulting his records. "Payments that came from Mr. Potter's trust, presented to them as government assistance. The blood protection required that Harry live with his mother's family," Dumbledore said, his tone becoming more formal. "The financial arrangements were merely incentive to ensure they fulfilled their obligations." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You paid them to take me in? With my own money?" "Harry," Dumbledore said gently, "you must understand the complexity of the situation. When your parents died, you became the target of every dark wizard who had served Voldemort. Traditional protective charms would not have been sufficient. Your mother's sacrifice created a unique magical protection, but it required very specific conditions to remain effective." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "You had to live with blood relatives. You had to be able to call their home your home. The protection would last until you came of age, but only if these conditions were maintained." "So you put me with people who hated me," Harry said flatly. "I put you with people who would keep you alive," Dumbledore corrected. "The Dursleys' feelings toward you were regrettable, but secondary to your survival." Harry stared at the man who had orchestrated his entire life. "And the money? 47,000 galleons for my protection?" Dumbledore's expression grew more guarded. Maintaining such complex protective magic requires resources, Harry. Safe house networks, protective charm research, monitoring systems, emergency response capabilities. All of these things require funding. "Show me," Harry said suddenly. "I beg your pardon?" "Show me the safe houses, the monitoring systems, the research." Harry's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. "If you spent my family's money on my protection, prove it." Griphook and Ragnok exchanged glances. It was a reasonable request, and they clearly expected Dumbledore to provide the documentation that would support his claims. Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time, his blue eyes studying Harry with an expression that seemed to mix regret with something that might have been pride. "Some things, my dear boy, are too dangerous to document in detail. The networks that have kept you safe operate in shadow, precisely because exposure would compromise their effectiveness." "How convenient," Harry said, and the adult cynicism in his 9-year-old voice clearly surprised everyone in the room. "Harry," Dumbledore tried again, his tone becoming more urgent, "you must understand that everything I have done has been for your protection. The wizarding world is not safe for you, even now. There are those who would use you, harm you, or worse, simply because of what you represent." "What do I represent?" Harry demanded. But again, Dumbledore deflected. "The important thing is that you have been kept safe. The protection I arranged has worked exactly as intended." Harry looked around the room, at the goblins with their meticulous records, at the evidence of systematic financial manipulation, at the man who spoke of protection while orchestrating a childhood of neglect and isolation. "I don't feel protected," Harry said quietly. "I feel lied to." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Dumbledore's composure seemed to crack slightly, revealing something underneath. Not malice, but a kind of paternalistic certainty that his decisions were inherently correct. "Sometimes," Dumbledore said carefully, "protection requires difficult choices. Choices that may seem cruel in the short term, but serve a greater good in the long term." "Greater good," Harry repeated. "That's what this is about? Some greater good that required stealing from me and lying to me and letting me grow up thinking I was worthless?" "You are not worthless, Harry," Dumbledore said with sudden intensity. "You are, in fact, extraordinarily valuable, which is precisely why such extreme measures were necessary to keep you safe." But Harry was no longer listening to the explanations and justifications. He was thinking about cupboards and hand-me-down clothes and birthday celebrations that never came. He was thinking about money that could have changed his life being spent on protection he never saw and care he never received. "I want it back," he said simply. Dumbledore blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "My money, I want it back. All of it." Harry's green eyes were steady and uncompromising. "And I want to choose my own protection from now on." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Dumbledore looked as if he had been struck, while the goblins watched with expressions of professional satisfaction. "Harry," Dumbledore said carefully, "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. The protections I've arranged cannot simply be dismantled without—" "Then explain them to me," Harry interrupted. "All of them. Show me what you've done with my money, and let me decide if I want to keep paying for it." For the first time since entering the office, Albus Dumbledore looked genuinely uncomfortable. And in that discomfort, Harry glimpsed something that changed everything. This man, for all his power and authority and grand explanations about greater goods, was afraid of a 9-year-old boy asking reasonable questions. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. If Dumbledore was afraid of Harry's questions, then perhaps those questions were more powerful than Harry had ever imagined. The revelation came buried in a legal document that Ragnok produced with the careful precision of someone handling explosive material. There is, of course, the matter of your designated magical guardian, the goblin said, spreading yet another set of official papers across his desk. Your parents were quite specific in their wishes regarding your care. Harry leaned forward, still reeling from his confrontation with Dumbledore, who had departed with promises to review the situation and consider appropriate adjustments. The evasiveness had been maddening, but these documents looked different, more personal somehow. Designated guardian? Harry asked. Indeed. Ragnok adjusted his spectacles and began reading from a parchment that bore the Potter family seal. In the event of the deaths of James and Lily Potter, guardianship of their son Harry, James Potter shall pass immediately to Sirius Orion Black, chosen godfather and trusted friend, with all accompanying rights and responsibilities, including but not limited to financial oversight, educational decisions, and protective custody. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He had a godfather. Someone his parents had chosen specifically to care for him. Someone they had trusted with his life and his future. "Who is Sirius Black?" Harry whispered. Griphook consulted another file, this one marked with official ministry seals. Sirius Black was your father's best friend. They attended Hogwarts together, served together in the war against you-know-who, and apparently shared a bond that your parents considered equivalent to brotherhood. Harry's heart began to race. Where is he? Why didn't he take me when my parents died? The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Ragnok and Griphook exchanged glances that suggested they were about to deliver news that would be both significant and devastating. "Mr. Black," Ragnok said carefully, "is currently serving a life sentence in Azkaban prison for the betrayal and murder of your parents." The words seemed to echo in Harry's ears without making immediate sense. His godfather, the person his parents had chosen to raise him, was in prison for killing them. "I don't understand," Harry said slowly. Griphook pulled out a newspaper clipping dated November 2nd, 1981, just days after Harry's parents had died. The headline read, "Black betrays Potters. Death Eater arrested after mass murder." According to the official record, Griphook explained, Sirius Black was the secret keeper for your parents' location while they were in hiding. He allegedly revealed that information to you-know-who, leading directly to their murders. When confronted by another friend, Peter Pettigrew, Black killed him and 12 Muggle bystanders in a public explosion. Harry stared at the newspaper photograph of a man with long dark hair and a gaunt, almost wild expression. This was supposed to be his godfather. This was the person his parents had trusted with his life. But if he betrayed them, Harry said, struggling to work through the logic, why would they have made him my guardian in the first place? Why would they trust him with me if they couldn't trust him with their own lives? It was a fair question, and one that clearly troubled the goblins. Ragnok frowned as he studied the documents. The guardianship papers were signed in July of 1981, he said slowly. Mr. Black's alleged betrayal occurred in October of the same year. Your parents trusted him completely for years, right up until he supposedly turned traitor, Harry finished. Indeed. Ragnok set the documents aside with obvious reluctance, which presents us with a significant legal complication. Harry looked between the two goblins. What kind of complication? Under goblin law, Griphook explained, a designated guardian retains certain rights regarding their ward's inheritance, even if circumstances prevent them from exercising custody. Mr. Black's imprisonment means he cannot raise you, but technically, He remains your legal magical guardian until he formally renounces the role or dies. Which means, Harry prompted. Which means, Ragnok said grimly, that Professor Dumbledore's guardianship claims have been legally questionable from the beginning. He has been withdrawing funds from your trust for 8 years without proper authorization from your actual guardian. Harry felt the ground shifting beneath him again. So everything he's done has been done without legal standing under magical law, Griphook confirmed. The Ministry may recognize his authority as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot in matters of child placement, but Gringotts recognizes only properly executed magical guardianship documents. Harry studied the photograph of Sirius Black again. The man looked nothing like the gentle, caring figure he might have imagined as his godfather. But then again, newspaper photographs from Azkaban were hardly likely to capture anyone at their best. What was he like? Harry asked quietly. Before whatever happened. Ragnok consulted another file, this one containing what appeared to be personal records and character references. By all accounts, Mr. Black was fiercely loyal to your parents. He was the best man at their wedding, the first person they told when you were born, and someone they considered family in every sense, but blood. The records also show, Griphook added, that he was instrumental in funding several safe houses and protective measures during the war. His own family fortune was largely depleted in service to the cause against you-know-who. Harry felt a strange mix of emotions, loss for the relationship he might have had, confusion about the betrayal, and something that might have been hope. If he was that loyal, if they trusted him that much, how did he end up betraying them? That, Ragnok said carefully, is a question that many have asked, but few have answered satisfactorily. The trial records are sparse. What do you mean, sparse? Griphook's expression grew troubled. According to Ministry records, Mr. Black was captured at the scene of his confrontation with Peter Pettigrew. Witnesses saw the explosion, saw Pettigrew's remains, saw Black standing over the destruction. He was arrested immediately and transferred to Azkaban within days. But no trial? Harry asked, picking up on what they weren't saying. The evidence was considered overwhelming, Ragnok replied. In the chaos following you-know-who's defeat, many legal procedures were abbreviated. Mr. Black was sentenced without a formal hearing. Harry stared at the documents spread before him, his parents' careful plans for his care, his godfather's imprisonment, the legal complications surrounding his inheritance. It painted a picture of a system that had failed him at every level. So my parents chose someone to take care of me. But he's in prison for killing them. Dumbledore has been spending my money without permission because my actual guardian can't authorize it. And the Ministry put Sirius Black in prison without even giving him a trial to explain himself. That, Ragnok said with goblin precision, appears to be an accurate summary of the situation. Harry looked at the photograph of Sirius Black again, studying the man who should have been his guardian, who should have raised him, who should have protected him from cupboards and neglect and lies. Instead, he was rotting in the wizarding world's most terrible prison for crimes that, Harry was beginning to suspect, might not have happened the way the official story claimed. I want to see him, Harry said suddenly. Both goblins looked startled. Mr. Potter, Ragnok said carefully, Azkaban is not a place for children. It is a fortress of despair, guarded by creatures that feed on hope and happiness. Even adult visitors often require days to recover from the experience. He's my godfather, Harry said with quiet determination. My parents chose him to take care of me. Whether he betrayed them or not, whether he's guilty or innocent, I have the right to see him. That, Griphook said slowly, would require special permissions from the Ministry. permissions that might be difficult to obtain. Harry looked at the evidence of systematic failures spread across Ragnarok's desk. 40 years of unauthorized withdrawals, legal guardianship ignored, a trial that never happened. The pattern was becoming clear. The wizarding world's institutions were either corrupt, incompetent, or both. "Then we'll make them explain why," Harry said. "All of it. Dumbledore's withdrawals, Sirius Black's imprisonment without trial, the Ministry's failure to provide proper oversight. We'll make them explain everything." As he spoke, Harry felt something new building inside him. Not just anger at the deception, but a sense of purpose. For 9 years, other people had made decisions about his life without consulting him. They had decided where he would live, how he would be treated, and what he would know about his own history. But Harry was beginning to understand that he had more power than anyone had wanted him to realize. He had rights, he had resources, and he had questions that demanded answers. Most importantly, he had the truth on his side. And in his experience with the Dursleys, truth was often the most powerful weapon of all. The Ministry of Magic's official response arrived 3 days later, in the form of a formal delegation that included Minister Millicent Bagnold herself, 2 senior department heads, and a small army of assistants carrying briefcases and looking deeply uncomfortable. Harry had spent those 3 days living in a guest suite at the Leaky Cauldron, courtesy of Gringotts' Client Protection Services, a phrase that apparently meant they weren't sending him back to Privet Drive until the situation was resolved. The magical pub was a revelation in itself, with its talking portraits and self-stirring cauldrons. But Harry found himself too preoccupied with the unfolding crisis to properly appreciate the wonder of it all. Now he sat in the largest conference room at Gringotts, surrounded by goblins, ministry officials, and enough paperwork to fuel a bonfire. The atmosphere was tense, with the particular strain that accompanied institutional accountability. Minister Bagnold was smaller than Harry had expected, with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, but Harry could see the stress lines around her eyes that suggested this particular crisis was testing even her considerable experience. "Mr. Potter," she said, her voice crisp and professional as she took her seat across from him. "I want to begin by apologizing for the irregularities that have come to light regarding your trust fund. The Ministry takes its responsibilities toward magical orphans very seriously." Harry studied her carefully. He was learning to listen not just to what adults said, but to how they said it. Minister Bagnold's apology was formal and precise, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you?" Harry asked quietly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "Take your responsibilities seriously," Harry clarified, "because according to the goblins, no one from the Ministry has checked on me even once in 8 years. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The Ministry officials shuffled their papers and avoided eye contact, while the goblins watched with expressions of professional satisfaction. The Ministry operates under the assumption that designated guardians will fulfill their duties appropriately, one of the department heads interjected. Professor Dumbledore's reputation and standing in the community didn't authorize him to spend 47,000 galleons of my money, Harry interrupted, his voice remaining level despite the anger building beneath. And Sirius Black was my designated guardian, not Dumbledore. Minister Bagnold's sharp eyes fixed on the department head who had spoken. Is this accurate, Cornelius? The man, Cornelius Fudge according to his nameplate, seemed to shrink under her gaze. Well, Minister, the circumstances surrounding Mr. Black's imprisonment were extraordinary. Emergency measures seemed appropriate. Emergency measures that lasted 8 years without review, Ragnok interjected smoothly. Emergency measures that allowed unauthorized withdrawals from a protected trust. Minister Bagnold held up a hand to forestall further argument. Let's establish the facts clearly. Mr. Potter, would you summarize your understanding of the situation? Harry looked around the table at the assembled adults, some trying to help him, others clearly wishing he would disappear. For most of his life, he would have stammered and deferred to their authority. But these past few days had taught him that adult authority was neither automatic nor absolute. My parents left me money and chose a guardian to take care of me, Harry said clearly. The ministry put my guardian in prison without giving him a trial. Then Dumbledore started taking my money, claiming he was my guardian even though he wasn't. You paid the Dursleys to take care of me, but no one ever checked to see if they were actually doing it. And now that I've found out about all this, everyone wants to blame everyone else instead of fixing it. The summary hung in the air like an indictment. Minister Bagnold was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled before her as she absorbed Harry's words. That is, she said finally, an uncomfortably accurate assessment of our institutional failures. It was the first time any ministry official had actually acknowledged failure rather than offering explanations, and Harry felt a spark of hope that she might actually be different from the others. The question, Minister Bagnold continued, is how we proceed from here. Mr. Potter, what would you consider an appropriate resolution? Harry had been thinking about that question for 3 days. I want my money back, all of it. I want proper oversight of my accounts going forward. I want someone to explain to me exactly why Sirius Black is in prison without a trial. And I want to make sure this never happens to another magical orphan. The last point seemed to surprise the minister. You're concerned about other orphans? If it happened to me, it could happen to anyone, Harry said simply. How many other magical children have guardians in prison? How many other trust funds are being raided by people claiming to act in their best interests? How many other kids are living in cupboards while adults spend their inheritance? Minister Bagnold exchanged glances with her department heads, and Harry could see calculations happening behind their eyes. Not just about his case, but about the broader implications of what he was suggesting. An audit of all orphan accounts would be substantial, Fudge said carefully. Then you should have been doing it all along, Harry replied with devastating logic. Mr. Potter raises valid concerns, Ragnok observed. Gringotts has identified at least 12 other accounts with similar irregularities in our preliminary review. This is not an isolated incident. The room went very quiet. Harry watched as the political implications sank in for the ministry officials. This wasn't just about one embarrassing case. This was about a systemic failure that had been ongoing for years. 12 other cases, Minister Bagnold repeated slowly. At minimum, Griphook confirmed. Our full audit is ongoing. Minister Bagnold closed her eyes briefly, and Harry could almost see her calculating the political damage. How long has this been going on? The earliest irregular withdrawal in our records dates to 1951, Ragnok said with goblin precision. 38 years of inadequate oversight. 38 years, the minister whispered, and for the first time she looked less like a politician and more like someone confronting a genuine crisis of conscience. Harry leaned forward. Minister Bagnold, what are you going to do about it? The question was direct enough to cut through political calculation and reach something more fundamental. The basic responsibility of leadership to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. We're going to fix it, she said, and this time her voice carried real conviction. All of it. Starting with your case and expanding to comprehensive reform of our orphan protection policies. She turned to her assistants. I want a full review of every magical orphan case from the past 50 years. I want new oversight protocols developed and implemented immediately. I want explanations for every irregular withdrawal from every protected account. And I want it all done transparently, with regular reports to the Wizengamot. Minister, Fudge began, the political implications, Bagnold cut him off sharply, are that we've failed in our most basic duty to protect magical children. I'd rather face political damage than continue that failure. She looked directly at Harry. You asked what I'm going to do about it. Mr. Potter, I'm going to ensure that no other magical child experiences what you've experienced. That's a promise from the Minister of Magic to you personally. Harry studied her face, looking for the signs of political calculation he was learning to recognize. But what he saw instead was something that might have been genuine regret and determination. What about Sirius Black? Harry asked. Minister Bagnold was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Black's case is complex. But you're right that the lack of a formal trial was irregular. I'll authorize a full review of his imprisonment and the circumstances surrounding his conviction. Not a review, Harry said firmly. A trial, a real one, with evidence and witnesses and all the things that should have happened 8 years ago. The minister nodded slowly. A trial. Yes, that's exactly what should happen. As the meeting continued with discussions of timelines and procedures, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in his 9 years of life. The sense that adults in positions of power were actually listening to him, taking his concerns seriously and committing to meaningful action. It was, he reflected, a very different feeling from living in a cupboard under the stairs. The letter to Remus Lupin took Harry 3 attempts to write. How did one reach out to a stranger who had been his father's friend? How did one explain 8 years of lies and theft to someone who had probably spent those same years grieving? In the end, Harry kept it simple. Mr. Lupin, I am Harry Potter, James and Lily's son. I have recently discovered some troubling information about my guardianship and inheritance. Would you be willing to meet with me? I think my parents would have wanted you to know what has happened. The response came within hours, written in handwriting that trembled slightly, but conveyed unmistakable urgency. Harry, yes, immediately. Where and when? R.J. Lupin. They met in a private room at the Leaky Cauldron, arranged by Tom the barkeeper, with the discretion that apparently came standard with magical hospitality. Harry arrived first, his stomach churning with nervousness about meeting someone who had actually known his parents as people rather than as tragic figures from newspaper clippings. Remus Lupin entered quietly, and Harry's first impression was of someone who carried exhaustion like a permanent weight. His hair was prematurely grey despite his young age. His robes were patched and shabby, and there was something in his amber eyes that spoke of old pain carefully controlled. But when those eyes found Harry across the room, they filled with an emotion so profound that Harry had to look away. "My God," Lupin whispered, sinking into the chair across from Harry. "You look so much like James, but you have Lily's eyes. Exactly her eyes." Harry had heard variations of this observation his entire life from people who had known his parents, but somehow, coming from Lupin, it felt different. Less like an observation, and more like a recognition. "Mr. Lupin," Harry began, but the older man raised a hand. "Remus, please. Your father and I, we weren't formal with each other." His voice caught slightly. "Though I suppose I should apologize for not being in your life these past 8 years. I assumed, foolishly it seems, that Dumbledore's arrangements were in your best interests. What did you assume, exactly? Harry asked. Lupin's expression grew troubled. That you were being cared for by loving relatives in a safe, comfortable home. That your needs were being met and your inheritance protected. That someone was ensuring you knew about your parents and their sacrifice. He paused. I was wrong about all of that, wasn't I? Harry spent the next hour explaining everything. The cupboard under the stairs, the lies about his parents, the systematic theft of his inheritance, the discovery of Sirius's imprisonment without trial. Lupin listened in silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. A cupboard, Lupin said finally, his voice hollow. They made you sleep in a cupboard. For 9 years, Harry confirmed. Lupin buried his face in his hands. James and Lily died to protect you. They gave their lives so that you could live and be happy and safe. And instead, he looked up, his amber eyes bright with unshed tears. Instead, you've been neglected and lied to and robbed by people who claimed to be acting in your best interests. Did you know Dumbledore was taking money from my trust? Harry asked. No. Lupin's response was immediate and emphatic. I knew nothing about your financial affairs. I assumed, another foolish assumption, that such matters were being handled appropriately by qualified adults. His voice turned bitter. It never occurred to me that those qualified adults might be helping themselves to your inheritance. Harry leaned forward. Remus, what were my parents really like? Not the heroic figures from the official story, but as people. For the next 2 hours, Lupin painted a picture of James and Lily Potter that was both more human and more wonderful than anything Harry had imagined. James, arrogant in his youth, but fiercely loyal to his friends, who grew into someone worthy of Lily's love. Lily, brilliant and kind, but with a temper that could wither flowers when she was truly angry, who saw the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. They were planning to take you somewhere safe when the war ended, Lupin said quietly. A cottage by the sea, where you could have a normal childhood. Lily talked about teaching you to read, and James was already planning to teach you to fly. They had such hopes for your future. The contrast between those hopes and Harry's actual experience was almost too painful to bear. There's something else you need to know, Harry said slowly. About Sirius. Lupin went very still. What about Sirius? Harry explained about the guardianship documents, the lack of a trial, the legal complications surrounding Dumbledore's authority. As he spoke, he watched Lupin's expression cycle through shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope. You're saying Sirius never had a trial? Lupin asked. Never. He was arrested at the scene and sent straight to Azkaban. No hearing, no presentation of evidence, no opportunity to defend himself. Lupin was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. I believed it, he said finally. When they said he had betrayed James and Lily, I believed it immediately. I was so angry, so heartbroken, that I never questioned the official story. I never thought to ask why someone who loved them as much as Sirius did would suddenly turn traitor. Minister Bagnold has agreed to authorize a proper trial, Harry said. Whatever really happened that night, we're going to find out. Lupin nodded slowly, but Harry could see the weight of 8 years of assumed guilt and grief in his expression. There's someone else I want to contact, Harry continued. Andromeda Tonks. Ragnarok says she's Sirius's cousin. Andromeda? Lupin's face brightened slightly. Yes, she was disowned by the Black family for marrying a Muggle-born, but Sirius always spoke of her fondly. She might be willing to help, even if she can't take official guardianship. Why can't she? Lupin's expression grew uncomfortable. The blood protection, Harry. Dumbledore wasn't entirely wrong about that part. The magic your mother invoked with her sacrifice is real and powerful, but it requires you to live with blood relatives until you come of age. The Dursleys are your only remaining blood family. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. So I'm trapped there. No matter what happens with the money or the oversight or anything else, I still have to go back to Privet Drive. For your safety, yes, Lupin said gently, but that doesn't mean you have to be alone. There's no reason you can't have regular contact with people who care about you, people who can ensure your welfare and advocate for your interests. 2 days later, Harry found himself in the sitting room of a comfortable house in a quiet London suburb, facing a woman who shared Sirius's dark hair and aristocratic features, but whose eyes held warmth instead of wildness. Andromeda Tonks listened to Harry's story with the same shocked attention that Lupin had shown, but her anger burned hotter and more focused. 47,000 galleons, she said when Harry finished, spent on your supposed protection while you lived in a cupboard. The goblins think they can recover most of it, Harry said. That's not the point. Andromeda's voice carried an edge that reminded Harry powerfully of the aristocratic bearing that ran in the Black family bloodline. The point is that this should never have happened in the first place. Someone should have been watching out for you. Someone should have checked on your welfare. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Harry, I can't be your legal guardian. The blood protection requirements prevent that, and frankly, my own situation is complicated. I was disowned by my family for marrying a Muggle-born, and many in the wizarding world still consider me a blood traitor. But, Harry prompted, sensing there was more, but I can be your advocate. I can ensure that the Dursleys understand they're being watched, that your welfare is being monitored by people who care about you. I can help you navigate the complexities of wizarding society and protect your interests when the adults around you fail to do so. Harry felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the tea Andromeda had served. You'd do that? For me? For you? And for Sirius? And for the memory of James and Lily, Andromeda said firmly. The Black family motto is toujours pur, always pure. But there's another kind of purity that matters more. Keeping faith with those who matter to us. As Harry sat in Andromeda's warm sitting room, listening to her stories about Sirius before his imprisonment and her memories of James and Lily, he began to understand something fundamental about family. Blood relations like the Dursleys might provide magical protection, but chosen family, people who cared about you by choice rather than obligation, provided something equally valuable. The knowledge that you mattered to someone, that your welfare was important, that you were not alone in the world. It wasn't the same as having proper guardians or living in a loving home, but it was something. And after 9 years of having nothing, something felt like everything. The new vault access protocols were ceremonial in their formality, as if Gringotts was determined to demonstrate that this time everything would be done properly. Harry sat at the head of a polished conference table in the bank's most secure meeting room, surrounded by goblins, ministry officials, and the small circle of advocates he had somehow accumulated over the past 2 weeks. The contrast with his usual position, ignored, dismissed, spoken about rather than spoken to, was not lost on him. "Mr. Potter," Ragnarok began, sliding a thick document across the table to Harry. "These are the new access protocols for Potter Family Trust, Vault 687. Under these terms, you are the sole authorized signatory for any withdrawals above 50 galleons. Smaller amounts may be accessed by your designated advocates for your immediate welfare, but all transactions will be reported to you monthly." Harry studied the document, noting how different it looked from the ones Dumbledore had used to authorize his withdrawals. Where those had been vague and open-ended, these were precise and restrictive. Every potential circumstance was accounted for. Every possible abuse was specifically prohibited. "Who are my designated advocates?" Harry asked. "As you requested, Remus Lupin and Andromeda Tonks have been granted limited access for expenses related to your health, education, and immediate welfare," Griphook explained. "Additionally, Gringotts will assign a goblin advocate to review all transactions and ensure they align with your stated interests." Minister Bagnold leaned forward. "The Ministry has also established an orphan welfare office that will monitor your case specifically. No more assuming that guardians are fulfilling their duties without verification." Harry looked around the table at the assembled adults who were working to protect his interests. It was surreal, after 9 years of having no one care about his welfare, to suddenly have an entire bureaucratic apparatus devoted to ensuring he was properly cared for. "What about compensation for what was taken?" Harry asked. Ragnarok's expression grew sharp with the particular satisfaction that goblins reserved for financial justice. "Professor Dumbledore has been presented with a detailed accounting of all unauthorized withdrawals from your trust. He has 30 days to either provide documentation justifying each expense or arrange for full restitution." "And if he can't?" Harry pressed. "Then Gringotts will pursue recovery through every legal avenue available to us," Ragnarok said, with evident relish, "including, if necessary, seizure of assets to cover the debt." Minister Bagnold shifted uncomfortably. "I want to emphasize that the Ministry hopes this matter can be resolved without such drastic measures. Professor Dumbledore's reputation and standing in the community mean nothing if he's a thief," Harry interrupted quietly. The blunt statement fell into the room like a stone into still water. Several of the Ministry officials looked shocked at hearing their most respected wizard described so baldly. But Harry was beyond worrying about adult sensibilities. If someone stole 47,000 galleons from anyone else, you'd arrest them, Harry continued. "The fact that Dumbledore is famous and powerful doesn't change what he did to me." Andromeda, who had been sitting quietly beside Lupin, spoke for the first time. "Harry is correct. Intent matters less than impact. Whatever Dumbledore's motivations, the result was the systematic impoverishment of a child who was already vulnerable. The new protocols will prevent such situations in the future," Lupin added diplomatically, "which is perhaps the most important outcome." Harry appreciated his advocate's support, but he wasn't quite ready to let go of the question of justice. "What about other children? The 12 other cases Ragnarok mentioned?" "A comprehensive review is underway," Minister Bagnold assured him. "Each case will be investigated individually, and appropriate remediation will be arranged. Your case has become the template for how such investigations should be conducted." Griphook produced another set of documents. "Speaking of templates, Mr. Potter, we've also drafted new standardized protections for all orphaned account holders, mandatory oversight, regular welfare checks, and strict limitations on guardian access to trust funds." Harry read through the proposed protections, noting how they addressed every abuse he had experienced. "This would have prevented what happened to me?" "Completely," Ragnarok confirmed. "These protocols will be presented to the Wizengamot for formal adoption into magical law." "Good." Harry signed the documents with a sense of satisfaction that surprised him. For the first time in his life, he was actively shaping the world around him, rather than simply enduring it. "Now," Ragnarok continued, "we need to discuss your immediate financial arrangements." He spread out yet another set of papers, these dealing with more practical matters than legal protections. "Given your continued residence with the Dursleys, We recommend establishing a separate account for your immediate welfare. This account would be managed by your advocates and used for appropriate expenses: clothing, school supplies, medical care, and other necessities." "How much?" Harry asked. "We suggest an initial transfer of 1,000 galleons, approximately £4,000, Ragnok said. "Enough to ensure your proper care without being so large as to invite misuse." Harry thought about the months he had gone without proper shoes, the times he had been denied medical care for injuries caused by Dudley's bullying, the years of wearing clothes that fit like sacks. £4,000 would change everything. "The Dursleys won't have access to this account?" Harry asked. "Absolutely not," Lupin said firmly. "The money will be held in a Muggle bank account, managed by Andromeda and myself. We'll ensure that you have everything you need for your health and education." "Additionally," Andromeda added, "we'll be conducting regular welfare visits. The Dursleys will understand that you are no longer isolated, that there are people watching who care about your treatment." Harry felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was there. The fear that had been his constant companion, fear of hunger, of neglect, of being completely alone, was finally beginning to fade. "What about Hogwarts?" Harry asked. "When I turn 11, will I be able to go?" "Of course," Minister Bagnold said. "Your Hogwarts letter will arrive on schedule, and all expenses will be covered by your trust fund. We'll also ensure that someone explains the magical world to you properly before you arrive, rather than leaving you to discover it by accident." Ragnok pulled out one final document. "Which brings us to this: a comprehensive educational trust that will cover not just Hogwarts expenses, but also tutoring, supplies, and any additional education you might want to pursue. Your parents wanted to ensure you had every opportunity to learn and grow." As Harry signed document after document, each one representing a piece of security and protection he had never had before, he found himself thinking about the difference between power and authority. For most of his life, authority figures had used their power over him to make him smaller, weaker, more dependent. But these adults were using their power to make him stronger, more independent, more capable of protecting himself. "There's one more thing," Harry said, as the meeting began to wind down. "I want to establish a fund for other magical orphans, kids who might be in situations like mine was." The room went quiet. Ragnok's eyebrows rose slightly, while Minister Bagnold looked genuinely surprised. "That's very generous, Mr. Potter," the minister said carefully. "But you're only 9. Such decisions might be better made when you're older." "I'm old enough to know what it's like to be forgotten," Harry replied. "I'm old enough to want to make sure other kids don't go through what I did." Andromeda smiled, and Harry caught a glimpse of the fierce pride that ran in the Black family bloodline. "How much did you want to allocate?" Harry thought about all the money that had been taken from him, all the years of deprivation and neglect. 5,000 galleons to start, enough to help kids who need advocates or better living situations, or just someone to make sure they're okay. "We can establish the fund as part of your trust arrangements," Ragnok said, making notes. "The Potter Orphan Welfare Fund. It has a certain ring to it." As the meeting concluded and the various documents were filed away in Gringotts' secure vaults, Harry found himself looking around the table at the people who had helped him reclaim control of his life. 2 weeks ago, he had been a powerless child living in a cupboard, ignorant of his inheritance, and isolated from anyone who might care about his welfare. Now he was still a 9-year-old boy who would have to return to Privet Drive and the blood protection that required him to call it home. But he was a 9-year-old boy with advocates who cared about him, resources to ensure his proper care, and the knowledge that he had the power to shape his own future. It wasn't everything he might have wanted, but it was infinitely more than he had ever dared to hope for. And sometimes, Harry was learning, hope was the most powerful thing of all. The transformation at Privet Drive was subtle, but unmistakable, like watching ice slowly melt under spring sunlight. Harry still slept in his cupboard. Blood protection required him to call Privet Drive home, and Dumbledore's magic apparently considered the cupboard part of that home. But now the door was left unlocked during the day. He now had proper bedding instead of a thin blanket, a reading lamp instead of a dying pen torch, and shelves for the books that Remus brought him during his weekly visits. More significantly, the Dursleys had stopped pretending he didn't exist. "Boy, Harry," Uncle Vernon corrected himself for the third time that week. "There's a letter for you on the kitchen table." The self-correction had become a ritual ever since Andromeda's first welfare visit 6 months ago. She had made it clear, in her crisp, aristocratic voice, that she expected Harry to be addressed by his proper name and treated with basic courtesy. The threat was never explicitly stated, but the Dursleys had developed a healthy fear of the woman who spoke with such quiet authority about ministry oversight and financial accountability. The letter was from Remus, as Harry had expected. They came every Tuesday, filled with stories about the magical world, explanations of wizarding customs, and carefully chosen anecdotes about James and Lily Potter. Today's letter included a hand-drawn diagram of Hogwarts Castle and a detailed explanation of the house system. "The sorting hat will place you in the house that best matches your character," Remus had written in his careful script. "Your father was in Gryffindor, known for courage and loyalty. Your mother was in Gryffindor as well, though the hat apparently considered Ravenclaw for her intelligence. Don't worry about living up to their legacy. You'll make your own." Harry folded the letter carefully and added it to the growing collection in his cupboard. 10 months of correspondence had given him a picture of the magical world that was both wonderful and complex, full of possibility, but also shadowed by old prejudices and political tensions. He was no longer the completely ignorant boy who had received that first Gringotts letter on his 9th birthday. "Harry!" Aunt Petunia's voice was still stiff, but it no longer carried the edge of active hostility that had characterized their interactions for 9 years. Your friend is here." Remus stood on the doorstep in his patched but clean robes, carrying his usual worn briefcase, and wearing the gentle smile that had become familiar to Harry over the months of their acquaintance. The Dursleys still didn't know quite what to make of him. He was too polite to dismiss, too shabby to intimidate them with wealth, and too obviously fond of Harry to be ignored. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Dursley," Remus said, with unfailing courtesy. "I hope you don't mind my taking Harry out for a few hours." "Not at all," Petunia replied, though her tone suggested she minded very much but had learned not to express it. Their destination today was Diagon Alley, where Remus had been gradually introducing Harry to the practical aspects of magical life. Over the past months, Harry had learned to navigate Gringotts with confidence, to distinguish between reputable shops and tourist traps, and to understand the social dynamics that governed magical society. "The thing about growing up in the magical world," Remus explained as they walked through the bustling alley, "is that you learn to see past the wonder to the ordinary lives underneath. Magic is a tool, not a miracle. It makes some things easier and other things more complicated." They stopped at Flourish and Blot's, where Remus purchased several books that would begin Harry's formal magical education. A History of Magic, the Standard Book of Spells, and Magical Theory joined the growing library in Harry's cupboard. "I won't be able to teach you practical magic until you have a wand," Remus said, but understanding the theory will help you when you start classes at Hogwarts." As they sat in the leaky cauldron sharing lunch, Harry found himself thinking about how different this conversation was from any he might have imagined a year ago. Then he had been a neglected child with no future beyond enduring whatever the Dursleys chose to dish out. Now he was actively preparing for a future that included education, relationships, and possibilities he was only beginning to understand. "Remus," Harry said, setting down his butterbeer. "What were my parents saving for? I mean, 47,000 galleons is a lot of money. What did they want me to do with it?" Remus was quiet for a moment, his amber eyes distant. "They wanted you to have choices, Harry. James came from a wealthy family and understood that money could provide freedom. The freedom to pursue your interests, to help others, to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was profitable." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Lily came from a working-class Muggle family and understood that money could provide security, the security to take risks, to stand up for your principles, to never be dependent on the goodwill of people who didn't have your best interests at heart." "Like Dumbledore," Harry said. "Perhaps." Remus's tone was carefully neutral. "Your parents trusted him, but trust should be earned through consistent action, not granted because of reputation." Over the months, Remus had helped Harry understand the complexities surrounding Dumbledore's actions. The man genuinely believed he was protecting Harry, but his methods had been paternalistic and ultimately harmful. The ongoing investigation into his financial management had revealed not malicious theft, but rather a casual assumption that he knew what was best for Harry without bothering to verify whether his assumptions were correct. "The compensation negotiations are going well," Remus added. "Dumbledore has agreed to restore 39,000 galleons to your trust. The remaining 8,000 has been documented as legitimate protective expenses. Ward maintenance, monitoring spells, and research into blood protection magic." Harry nodded. It was less than full restitution, but it represented acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to more careful oversight going forward. More importantly, the new regulations governing orphan trusts meant that future children would be protected from such casual appropriation of their inheritances. As they walked back through Diagon Alley, Harry noticed how other magical folk looked at him, not with the curiosity or awe he might have expected, but with a kind of respectful recognition. Word had spread through the magical community about the Potter orphan who had uncovered systematic corruption and forced institutional reform. He was no longer just the boy who lived. He was the boy who had demanded accountability from the most powerful wizard in Britain and won. "Are you nervous about Hogwarts?" Remus asked, as they prepared to return to Privet Drive. "A little," Harry admitted. "I'll know more than most students about magical theory. But I won't know the social things. Who's important? Which families have old grudges? How to navigate the politics?" "Those things matter less than you might think," Remus said gently. "What matters is staying true to who you are. Your parents were respected, not because they were politically savvy, but because they were genuinely good people who stood up for what was right." Back at Privet Drive, Harry found an unexpected scene in the kitchen. Aunt Petunia was arranging flowers in a vase, while Dudley helped himself to cake that hadn't been there when Harry left. "What's all this?" Harry asked. Petunia's cheeks reddened slightly. It's nearly your birthday, July 31st. We thought." She trailed off, unable to articulate what she was thinking, but Harry understood. For 10 years, his birthday had passed unacknowledged at Privet Drive. This year, with the knowledge that people were watching, that Harry's welfare was being monitored by individuals who cared about his treatment. The Dursleys were making an effort. It wasn't love. It might not even be genuine kindness, but it was acknowledgement that he was a person worthy of basic consideration, and after 10 years of invisibility, that felt like progress. "Thank you," Harry said simply. That evening, as he sat in his cupboard reading Remus's latest letter by proper lamplight, surrounded by books and birthday gifts and the evidence of a life that was finally moving forward, Harry reflected on how much had changed since that first owl had arrived at his window. He was still 9 years old. He still lived with relatives who would never love him. He still faced an uncertain future in a world he was only beginning to understand. But he was no longer alone. He had advocates who cared about his welfare, resources to ensure his proper care, and the knowledge that he had the power to shape his own destiny. Most importantly, he had hope that his future would be different from his past. Hope that the magical world held possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Hope that the boy who had survived everything life had thrown at him so far could continue to not just survive, but thrive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to grow and learn and become the person his parents had hoped he could be. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Harry Potter fell asleep, looking forward to tomorrow, rather than merely enduring today. Exactly 1 year after the first owl had arrived at Privet Drive, Harry Potter woke to the sound of someone knocking at his cupboard door. Not the violent rattling that had characterized most of his childhood mornings, but a polite, measured tapping that acknowledged his right to privacy, even in such a small space. "Harry?" Aunt Petunia's voice carried none of the usual sharp impatience. "You have visitors." It was 6 o'clock in the morning on July 31st, 1990, his 10th birthday, and for the second year in a row, someone had remembered. Harry emerged from his cupboard, which now resembled a small but comfortable bedroom more than a storage space, to find Remus and Andromeda standing in the Dursley kitchen, their arms full of parcels and their faces bright with the kind of affection Harry was still learning to recognize and accept. "Happy birthday, Harry," Remus said warmly, setting his packages on the kitchen table with the easy familiarity of someone who had become a regular presence at Privet Drive. 10 years old, Andromeda added, her aristocratic features softened by genuine fondness. Double digits at last. The contrast with his 9th birthday could not have been more stark. Then, Harry had woken alone and ignored, unaware of his magical heritage, his inheritance, or the people who cared about his welfare. Now, he was surrounded by adults who had travelled across London before dawn to ensure his birthday began with recognition and celebration. Even the Dursleys had made an effort. Uncle Vernon sat at the breakfast table in his best dressing gown, while Aunt Petunia had prepared a proper breakfast that included items Harry actually enjoyed eating. Dudley, now a year older and marginally less obnoxious under the influence of regular supervision, had even wrapped a gift, a book about football that suggested he had put some thought into choosing something Harry might appreciate. It wasn't love, exactly, but it was courtesy, and after 9 years of invisibility, courtesy felt like a revolution. "How are the new protections working?" Andromeda asked, as Harry opened his gifts. Books from Remus, a beautiful eagle feather quill from Andromeda, and a small leather journal embossed with his initials from the goblins at Gringotts. "Very well," Harry replied, thinking of the comprehensive oversight system that now governed his welfare. Monthly visits from ministry representatives, quarterly financial reviews, regular correspondence with his advocates, and a support network that ensured he was never again isolated or forgotten. "I hardly recognize my life compared to last year." And the other orphans? Remus inquired. The Potter Welfare Fund? Harry's face lit up with pride. We've helped 6 children in the past year. 3 who needed better living arrangements, 2 who required medical care their guardians couldn't afford, and 1 who was being tutored by someone who was stealing from his trust. He paused. It feels good to know that what happened to me is helping prevent the same thing from happening to others. Andromeda and Remus exchanged glances of approval and something that might have been parental pride. Over the past year, they had watched Harry grow from a neglected, ignorant child into a thoughtful, capable young man who understood both his privileges and his responsibilities. Speaking of ongoing cases, Andromeda said carefully, there's news about Sirius. Harry set down his quill, his attention immediately focused. The question of his godfather's innocence or guilt remained the one unresolved shadow over his otherwise improving circumstances. Minister Bagnold has authorized a full review of his case, Remus explained. Not just the imprisonment, but a complete investigation into the events of that night in 1981. New evidence, witness interviews, magical analysis, everything that should have been done originally. What kind of new evidence? Harry asked. The kind that raises serious questions about the official story, Andromeda said grimly. Inconsistencies in witness statements, magical residue that doesn't match the supposed explosion, and testimony from people who were never interviewed during the original investigation. Harry felt his heart begin to race. Do you think he's innocent? I think, Remus said carefully, that he deserves a proper trial to determine that question. Whatever really happened that night, it deserves to be examined by people who aren't operating in the chaos and grief that followed Voldemort's defeat. The possibility that Sirius might be innocent, that Harry might have a godfather who was wrongly imprisoned, who should have been raising him all these years, was both thrilling and terrifying. It opened up possibilities for the future that Harry had never dared to consider. When will the review be completed? Harry asked. These things take time, Andromeda replied diplomatically. But Minister Bagnold has made it a priority. She's facing re-election next year, and she's learned that orphan welfare issues have significant political implications. Harry nodded, understanding the unspoken suggestion that his case had given him more influence than most 10-year-old boys could imagine. The Potter name carried weight in the magical world, and Harry was learning to use that weight responsibly. As the morning progressed and his birthday celebration continued, Harry found himself reflecting on the year that had passed since that first owl had changed everything. He was still Harry Potter, still 10 years old, still living in a cupboard at Privet Drive because blood magic required him to call this place home. In many ways, the fundamental circumstances of his life remained unchanged. But everything else was different. He had advocates who cared about his welfare, resources to ensure his proper care, knowledge about his heritage and his place in the magical world, and the confidence that came from successfully challenging corrupt authority. Most importantly, he had hope, real, tangible hope for a future that included education, relationships, and possibilities he was only beginning to understand. Your Hogwarts letter should arrive soon, Remus said, as they shared birthday cake in the early afternoon. Are you ready? Harry considered the question seriously. A year ago, he had been completely unprepared for the magical world, ignorant of its customs, isolated from its people, and unaware of his own significance within it. Now, thanks to months of careful education and gradual exposure, he understood both the wonders and the complexities of the world he would soon enter. I think so, Harry said. I know the theory. I understand the social dynamics, and I have people who will help me navigate whatever I don't understand yet. More importantly, Andromeda added, you know who you are. not just as the boy who lived or the Potter heir, but as Harry, someone who stands up for what's right, who uses his privileges to help others, and who isn't afraid to challenge authority when it fails in its responsibilities. As the afternoon wore on and his visitors prepared to leave, Harry stood in the kitchen of No. 4 Privet Drive and looked around at the space that had been his prison for 10 years. It was still small, still cramped, still dominated by people who would never truly care about him. But it was no longer a place of despair. The cupboard door stood open, revealing the books and letters and small treasures that marked a life with connections beyond these walls. The Dursleys moved around the kitchen with the careful courtesy of people who knew they were being watched by individuals with both the power and the inclination to hold them accountable. And Harry himself stood straighter, spoke with more confidence, and carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew his worth. "Thank you," Harry said to Remus and Andromeda as they prepared to leave. "For everything. For caring about me, for fighting for me, for helping me understand who I really am." "Thank you," Andromeda replied, "for being brave enough to ask the questions that needed to be asked, for refusing to accept that your situation was normal or acceptable, for showing all of us that children have the right to demand better from the adults who claim authority over them." After they left, Harry returned to his cupboard and pulled out the leather journal Andromeda had given him. On the first page he began to write, July 31st, 1990, 10 years old today. 1 year since the first letter from Gringotts changed everything. I still live in the same cupboard, with the same relatives, in the same small space. But I am not the same person I was a year ago. I know who my parents really were, not the failures the Dursleys claimed, but heroes who died protecting me and left me everything they could to ensure my future. I know I have a godfather who may be innocent of the crimes he was imprisoned for, and someday I might have the chance to know him properly. I know there are people in the magical world who care about my welfare and will fight to protect my interests. Most importantly, I know that I have the power to shape my own future. Not magic, not yet, but something more fundamental. The power that comes from asking questions, demanding accountability, and refusing to accept that things have to stay the way they are just because they've always been that way. Tomorrow, Remus will take me to Diagon Alley to buy my school supplies. In 6 weeks, I'll board the Hogwarts Express and begin my magical education. Someday, I might learn the truth about what really happened to my parents and whether the man they chose as my godfather deserves the fate that's been forced upon him. But today, on my 10th birthday, I'm just grateful to be Harry Potter. Not the boy who lived, not the Potter heir, but Harry, someone who has learned that even the smallest person can make a difference when they refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. He closed the journal and settled back against his pillow, listening to the quiet sounds of evening settling over Privet Drive. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, probably just an ordinary owl, not a magical messenger bringing life-changing news. But Harry smiled anyway, remembering another owl on another July evening that had begun the transformation of his entire world. Change, Harry had learned, often began with the simplest things. A letter, a question, a refusal to accept that things had to remain as they were. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very determined, that change could transform not just your own life, but the lives of others who had been waiting for someone brave enough to speak up. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter fell asleep, not just hopeful about the future, but confident that he had the power to shape it into something worthy